Installing and configuring enterprise software on servers can be very difficult. There are many decisions to be made for settings, for locations on different servers. That's why it's so comforting to have the idea of best practices for installing software and then maintaining it. But the problem is that many issues do not lend themselves to the idea of a best practice. A best practice promises too much. The best practice suggests that this is the way to do it, and once you do something in accordance with the best practice, you can have a warm and fuzzy feeling that you have done the best you can. It is my opinion that instead of using the phrase best practice, more often I would rather use the phrase rule of thumb. A rule of thumb is something you do to start with until you find some reason for doing something differently. For instance, we have rules of thumb, sometimes called best practices, for degree of parallelism and for the number of tempDB files you have on a SQL server. And I would say these are good rules of thumb. If you're setting up a server and you don't know anything about its performance characteristics, then the rule of thumb is a very good place to start. But after you get your server in operation, you may discover that some of those queries don't run the way you would like them to with the degree of parallelism specified. At that point, you change it, and you're no longer in sync with a best practice. So what does it mean, best? Well, maybe I'm being too picky on words, but it is my experience that many people like the idea of best practices because then they don't have to think, and more importantly, they don't have to test. Testing is probably the most overlooked part of deploying a new solution. And there will be many issues for which there are so many variables. Even if you knew the values of all those variables, there would be no formula for plugging them into to determine what a configuration option should be set to. There cannot be a best practice for that. There's just too much complexity to permit a single one-size-fits-all answer. Now, as a PFE for SQL Server, one of the questions I am most frequently asked is, how much memory should I leave for the operating system? And I intend to address that in a video or two, but the answer is there's no single answer. But that doesn't mean it's just a vague, it depends answer. Just because we don't have a perfect rule, a perfect best practice, if we dig a little deeper, we can see how to correlate your environment with things we can measure to come up with an answer. So just because there isn't a specific answer we can give for one size fits all, we can help determine what the answer is for you on this issue. And it can be much more concrete than you might think, but there just isn't a simple best practice. So I try to avoid using the word best practice in all except the most clear-cut examples where it would be hard to deny that, say, a certain configuration setting was the best all the time for everybody. And I just haven't found that many of them. That's the reason these things are configurable. So you'll hear me talking about rules of thumb rather than best practices.